You are just a waitress. Stay in your lane. The words landed with a confident smirk, but no one in the room realized they would become the most expensive sentence spoken that evening. Rain shimmered across the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking downtown Manhattan, as the city's lights reflected against polished marble and crystal glass. Inside the private executive dining suite of one of New York's most exclusive hotels, history appeared only moments away from being written. Alexander Hayes, a white billionaire chief executive officer celebrated for building one of America's fastest-growing investment firms, adjusted the cuff of his tailored charcoal suit while reviewing the final signature page of a $3.2 billion acquisition. Around the polished walnut conference table sat attorneys, investment bankers, senior analysts, board members, and financial advisors who had spent nearly 8 months preparing for this transaction. Every presentation had been rehearsed. Every legal document had been reviewed. Every financial projection had supposedly survived countless rounds of scrutiny. Confidence filled the room because everyone believed there were no surprises left. Quietly moving between the executives was Zoe Mitchell, a black waitress whose elegant black uniform blended naturally into the luxury surroundings. She served fresh coffee with practiced grace, replacing empty cups before anyone noticed they needed attention. To everyone present, she was simply part of the restaurant staff. Invisible, professional, easily forgotten. Yet while placing a fresh cup beside one of the analysts, her eyes briefly caught a financial summary displayed on a large presentation screen. She looked away immediately. Then she stopped. Something inside the valuation model felt strangely familiar. Not because she had seen the company before, but because the relationship between two assumptions refused to make sense. She continued serving coffee without changing her expression, yet her mind quietly reconstructed the numbers she had glimpsed. Revenue growth, manufacturing expansion, operating costs, capital investment. One assumption appeared disconnected from the rest. Alexander accepted a premium fountain pen from his attorney as photographers outside the conference suite waited for confirmation that another multi-billion-dollar acquisition had been completed. The chief financial officer smiled confidently before saying, "Everything has been verified. We are ready whenever you are." Several executives nodded with complete assurance. Champagne rested on a nearby table waiting to celebrate another successful victory. Zoe carried the silver coffee pot toward the exit, telling herself the financial model was none of her business. She worked in hospitality, not corporate finance. Speaking would almost certainly embarrass her and interrupt one of the most important business meetings of the year. She took another step toward the door before quietly stopping. Years of studying financial statements after long work shifts had taught her one lesson she never ignored. When numbers stop telling the same story, someone eventually pays the price. She slowly turned around and approached the conference table with respectful hesitation. Alexander noticed her movement and looked up briefly. Before she could speak, he smiled politely but dismissively. "Is there something else?" Zoe answered carefully. "Sir, I think one assumption inside the valuation deserves another look." A few executives exchanged amused glances. Alexander gave a faint laugh before leaning back comfortably in his chair. "You are just a waitress," he said with an easy smirk. "I think my finance team has this covered." Zoe remained calm. She did not argue. She did not raise her voice. She simply looked toward the presentation screen one final time before quietly saying, "If I am mistaken, you lose less than a minute. If I am right, you might save much more than that." A digital countdown clock in the corner of the presentation display marked the remaining time before the scheduled signing. 47 seconds remained. No one in the room realized those next 47 seconds were about to change every assumption they had made about business, intelligence, and the person standing silently beside the coffee service. Alexander Hayes looked at Zoe Mitchell for only a second before turning his attention back toward the signature page. The faint smile on his face suggested the conversation had already ended in his mind. Around the polished conference table, several executives exchanged knowing looks. One investment banker quietly chuckled while another leaned back in his chair with complete confidence. The atmosphere remained relaxed because nobody believed a waitress could possibly identify something that months of professional analysis had missed. The digital clock continued counting down. 46 seconds. 45. 44. Zoe did not move. She neither defended herself nor attempted to convince anyone through emotion. Her expression remained composed because she understood that facts never become stronger simply because they are spoken louder. Alexander rested the fountain pen above the final signature line before glancing once more toward her. "I appreciate your concern," he said politely, "but this acquisition has been reviewed by some of the best financial minds in the country." Zoe answered with quiet respect. "I do not question their intelligence, sir. I only question whether two assumptions are telling the same business story." Those words caught the attention of Ethan Brooks, Alexander's executive assistant, who happened to be standing beside the presentation console. Ethan had spent years organizing executive meetings and knew that successful leaders rarely ignored unexpected observations without at least understanding them. He quietly looked toward the financial summary projected across the large display. Something about Zoe's confidence made him hesitate. She had not sounded emotional. She had sounded certain. Alexander noticed Ethan studying the screen and smiled faintly. "You have 30 seconds before the scheduled signing," he joked. "If curiosity wins, make it quick." Ethan nodded respectfully before walking toward the chief financial officer. "Would you mind checking one relationship inside the operating assumptions?" he asked. The chief financial officer accepted the request almost casually. "Certainly. It will only take a moment." He connected his laptop to the presentation system, while continuing to reassure the room. "Everything has already been independently verified." The first spreadsheet appeared on the large display. Revenue forecasts, operating expenses, manufacturing expansion, capital allocation. Every figure looked perfectly organized. The executives remained relaxed. Champagne glasses waited untouched near the window overlooking Manhattan. 28 seconds remained. Ethan quietly pointed toward two sections of the financial model. "She mentioned the assumptions, not the formulas." The chief financial officer zoomed into the operational forecast before comparing it against the projected acquisition synergies. His expression remained calm until he opened the supporting schedule, connected to long-term production capacity. His fingers stopped moving across the keyboard for a brief moment. He enlarged another worksheet, then another. The confident smile slowly disappeared from his face. Without saying anything, he began recalculating one section manually instead of relying on the existing model. 20 seconds remained. One senior analyst noticed the unusual silence and walked closer to the screen. "What did you find?" he asked quietly. "I am not sure yet," the chief financial officer replied. "The formulas appear correct." He paused again before opening another file. "But something inside the assumptions is not aligning the way I expected." Alexander slowly lowered the fountain pen onto the polished table instead of onto the contract. For the first time that evening, complete silence settled across the room. Nobody laughed anymore. Nobody looked toward Zoe with amusement. They looked toward the presentation screen instead, where a single unanswered question had quietly begun rewriting the outcome of a $3.2 billion decision, while the countdown clock continued moving relentlessly toward zero. The conference room remained completely silent as the chief financial officer continued rebuilding the valuation model from its original source files. The countdown clock reached zero, yet nobody reached for the contract. Outside the glass walls, photographers still waited for an announcement they believed was only moments away. Inside, every executive had forgotten the cameras. Their attention was fixed entirely on the growing collection of spreadsheets covering the presentation screen. Alexander Hayes stood motionless beside the conference table with his fountain pen resting quietly against the unsigned agreement. His confidence had not disappeared, but it had been replaced by something every successful leader eventually learns to value even more: curiosity. The chief financial officer opened another worksheet and compared projected manufacturing capacity against the aggressive revenue forecast supporting the acquisition price. He frowned slightly before asking one of the senior analysts to verify the numbers independently. The analyst rebuilt the same section from the beginning without referencing the existing calculations. Several moments later, he looked up with visible uncertainty. "I am getting the same result," he admitted. Another financial specialist immediately repeated the process using a different model. Again, the outcome refused to change. The formulas were mathematically accurate. The assumptions driving them were not. Alexander slowly walked toward the presentation screen. Explain exactly what you are seeing. The chief financial officer enlarged two operating schedules side by side. The valuation assumes extremely aggressive growth immediately after the acquisition, he said calmly. However, the operational forecast does not include enough production capacity, staffing expansion, or infrastructure investment to support that level of growth. The spreadsheet calculates exactly what we instructed it to calculate, but the underlying business assumptions contradict one another. A quiet wave of concern spread across the room. One attorney removed his glasses and leaned closer to the display. Another executive reopened the original due diligence report, searching for the missing connection everyone had overlooked. Ethan Brooks quietly glanced toward Zoe Mitchell, who remained standing beside the coffee service with the same calm expression she had carried from the beginning. She did not appear pleased. She did not appear nervous. She simply waited while the evidence spoke for itself. The chief financial officer continued examining the revised projections before carefully entering corrected operating assumptions into the financial model. The numbers across the screen immediately shifted. Revenue expectations declined. Future cash flow adjusted downward. The estimated company value dropped dramatically. Nobody spoke for several long seconds. Finally, one senior analyst broke the silence. Run it again. The model was rebuilt a fourth time from completely independent data. The conclusion remained identical. The chief financial officer slowly turned toward Alexander. If we had signed this agreement tonight, we would have purchased the company using a valuation inflated by more than $3.2 billion. Every person in the room understood the weight of those words. The acquisition that had seemed certain less than a minute earlier had nearly become one of the most expensive mistakes in corporate history. Alexander looked from the revised valuation to the unsigned contract resting quietly on the polished table. Then he turned toward Zoe for the first time without a trace of amusement in his expression. The smile that had dismissed her as only a waitress had completely disappeared. In its place stood genuine respect mixed with one unavoidable question. How had the one person nobody expected to understand corporate finance become the first person to recognize what an entire team of experienced professionals had failed to see? No one reached for the champagne waiting beside the panoramic windows. The celebration that had been carefully planned for months quietly disappeared without anyone saying a single word. Alexander Hayes walked back to the conference table and gently closed the leather folder containing the unsigned acquisition agreement. The soft sound echoed through the room with surprising weight. Everyone understood what it meant. The transaction had stopped. The lead attorney immediately collected the signature pages and placed them inside his briefcase. "We are suspending execution of the agreement," he said calmly. "No documents leave this room until every financial assumption has been verified again." The chief financial officer nodded in complete agreement. "I recommend a full independent review before continuing negotiations." Alexander looked directly at him. "Not recommended," he replied quietly. "Required." Around the conference table, experienced executives who had entered the evening, expecting another successful announcement, now found themselves reviewing reports with renewed humility. One senior analyst quietly admitted, "We spent months validating formulas. We should have spent more time validating whether the assumptions described the same business reality." Another executive slowly nodded. "We assumed consistency because the spreadsheets were internally correct." Alexander remained silent for several moments before finally speaking. "That assumption nearly cost us $3.2 billion. The room became completely still again. Every person present understood that the financial loss would not simply have appeared on a balance sheet. It would have affected shareholders, employees, future investments, and the credibility of an entire organization. Alexander slowly turned toward Zoe Mitchell, who had respectfully remained near the coffee station, allowing the executives to complete their discussion without interruption. She had never attempted to prove herself. She had only asked them to look again. "Miss Mitchell," Alexander said calmly, "would you join us at the table?" Several executives instinctively stood as she approached, a remarkable contrast to the way they had overlooked her only minutes earlier. Zoe hesitated briefly before taking the empty chair closest to the presentation screen. She remained composed, folding her hands quietly in front of her. Alexander sat across from her. his expression now carrying genuine respect instead of casual confidence. "I owe you an apology," he said openly. "When you first spoke, I judged your profession before I considered your observation. That was my mistake." Zoe answered with quiet grace. "You were protecting a process that had earned your trust." "I understand that." Her response surprised everyone in the room because it contained neither resentment nor triumph. She offered understanding instead of criticism. Alexander appreciated that even more. "Would you help us understand exactly what you noticed?" he asked. Zoe looked toward the presentation screen where the corrected financial model remained displayed. "It was never one isolated number," she replied gently. "It was the relationship between several assumptions. The growth forecast expected one business, while the operational capacity described another. Both sections looked reasonable individually, but together they could not exist at the same time." Several analysts immediately reopened their laptops, this time listening carefully instead of defending previous work. Alexander noticed something extraordinary unfolding before him. The room had completely changed. Earlier, everyone had spoken over the quiet waitress. Now some of the most accomplished financial professionals in the country waited patiently for her next sentence. Authority had not shifted because someone demanded it. Authority had shifted because evidence quietly earned it. And for the first time that evening, Alexander realized the most valuable expertise in the room had never been introduced by an impressive title. It had arrived carrying a silver coffee pot. Zoe Mitchell looked at the presentation screen for a few quiet seconds before standing and walking toward it with measured confidence. She did not carry herself like someone trying to impress a room full of executives. She carried herself like someone following evidence wherever it happened to lead. Alexander Hayes remained seated beside the conference table, watching carefully as the woman he had dismissed only minutes earlier accepted the attention of the entire boardroom without changing her calm demeanor. Every executive followed her movements. The atmosphere had shifted completely. Earlier they had questioned why she was speaking. Now they waited to hear every word. Zoe picked up the wireless presentation remote and enlarged two sections of the financial model. "May I show you what I noticed?" she asked politely. Alexander nodded immediately. "Please." She highlighted the projected revenue growth displayed on the left side of the screen, before selecting the operational expansion schedule on the right. "Neither of these assumptions is unreasonable by itself," she explained. "The problem begins when they are expected to happen together." The chief financial officer leaned forward with genuine interest. Zoe continued speaking in simple language that everyone could follow. "If the company expects this level of revenue growth immediately after the acquisition, it also needs enough production capacity, additional employees, equipment investment, and operational infrastructure to support that growth. Those investments never appear inside the model. The spreadsheet calculates correctly, but it is calculating an unrealistic business story." Several analysts immediately reopened supporting schedules, while comparing every connected assumption. One senior associate quietly nodded as the relationship became impossible to ignore. "She is right," he admitted. "We validated the mathematics instead of validating the business." Zoe gently returned the remote to the conference table. Numbers should always support reality. When the story behind the numbers becomes inconsistent, the formulas cannot fix it. Her explanation filled the room with thoughtful silence. No complicated financial terminology had been necessary. She had simply connected the assumptions the way experienced operators connect real businesses. Alexander slowly stood and walked toward the presentation screen. "How long did it take you to recognize this?" he asked. Zoe answered honestly. "Only a few seconds." Several executives looked surprised. She smiled modestly before explaining. "Not because I am unusually fast. Because I always ask the same question first. If this company really grows this quickly, what must also change?" When I could not find the answer inside the model, I knew something deserved another look. The chief financial officer quietly closed his laptop. That question alone would have saved us weeks of unnecessary analysis. Another board member added, "We became so focused on individual departments that we stopped viewing the company as one connected system." Alexander remained thoughtful as he looked around the room. Earlier that evening, every impressive resume, prestigious title, An expensive suit had created the illusion that expertise belonged only to certain people. Now that illusion had quietly disappeared. Zoe had not defeated anyone. She had simply reminded them that wisdom belongs to those willing to understand, not merely those expected to understand. Alexander finally smiled with sincere admiration. "Miss Mitchell," he said warmly, "you did not save this acquisition. You saved us from making a decision that would have damaged every investor who trusted our judgment." Zoe lowered her eyes respectfully before answering. "I only hoped someone would ask one more question before signing." At that moment, every executive in the room realized the greatest strength inside any organization is never blind confidence. It is the humility to stop, listen, and examine the truth one more time before believing that every answer has already been found. The conference room remained quiet, even after the financial discussion had ended. No one seemed eager to leave because everyone understood they had witnessed something far more valuable than a successful negotiation. Alexander Hayes slowly walked toward the panoramic windows overlooking Manhattan before turning back toward Zoe Mitchell. His expression reflected thoughtful respect rather than executive authority. "May I ask you something personal?" he said gently. Zoe nodded. "Of course." Alexander paused briefly before speaking again. "Where did you learn corporate finance?" Several executives leaned forward with quiet curiosity. They had all been wondering the same question since the acquisition had been suspended. Zoe smiled softly, almost as though the answer belonged to someone else's story. "I attended college for 2 years," she replied. "Finance was my major." The room grew noticeably quieter. "I intended to finish my degree, but my mother became seriously ill. Her medical treatments quickly became more expensive than our family could manage, so I left school and accepted the first full-time job that provided stable income and health insurance." She glanced toward the neatly arranged coffee service beside the wall. "That job happened to be here." No one interrupted her. There was no sadness in her voice, only quiet honesty. "Did you ever stop studying?" Alexander asked. Zoe gently shook her head. "Never." She smiled with quiet determination. "Every evening after work I borrowed finance books from the public library. I downloaded annual reports from public companies. I rebuilt valuation models using publicly available information because I wanted to understand why successful businesses made certain decisions. I treated every balance sheet as another lesson." The chief financial officer looked genuinely impressed. "You taught yourself all of this while working full-time?" Zoe answered simply. "Learning does not always require a classroom. It only requires consistency." Those words settled deeply across the room. One senior board member slowly removed his glasses before quietly saying, "Most people believe opportunity creates preparation. You prepared long before opportunity ever arrived." Zoe smiled modestly. "I never expected tonight to happen. I only believed that if I kept learning, one day the knowledge might help someone." Alexander looked toward the financial reports still displayed across the presentation screen. Earlier that evening he had seen only a waitress carrying coffee. Now he saw years of quiet discipline hidden behind a uniform that most people never looked beyond. He realized how easily appearances had shaped his first judgment. "I owe you more than an apology," he admitted sincerely. "I underestimated you because I looked at your position instead of your potential." Zoe answered with calm kindness. "Many people make quick assumptions. What matters is whether they are willing to change them after discovering the truth." Her response impressed the executives even more than her financial insight. She corrected misunderstanding without creating embarrassment. She demonstrated confidence without arrogance. Alexander slowly nodded. "That may be the greatest lesson of tonight." Around the conference table, several analysts quietly reflected on their own careers. They had earned prestigious degrees and respected titles, yet the person who had saved the company from an extraordinary mistake had spent years studying alone after finishing late restaurant shifts. Talent had never disappeared. It had simply remained unseen until one unexpected moment demanded it. As the city lights continued shining beyond the windows and the rain softly traced patterns across the glass, everyone inside the room understood that genuine brilliance is rarely announced by status. More often it grows quietly through discipline, humility, and the determination to keep learning long after the world has stopped expecting anything extraordinary from you. The rain had finally stopped outside, but no one inside the executive dining suite seemed interested in leaving. The postponed acquisition had become almost secondary to the lesson unfolding before everyone present. Alexander Hayes slowly returned to the head of the conference table and looked around the room, meeting the eyes of every executive who had participated in the negotiation. The confidence that usually defined his leadership remained, but it was now balanced by genuine humility. Tonight was not simply about finding an error, he began calmly. Tonight exposed a weakness in the way we think. The room remained silent as every executive listened carefully. Alexander continued. We trusted titles more than thoughtful questions. We assumed expertise belonged only to the people sitting around this table. Several board members quietly lowered their eyes. No one argued because everyone understood the truth behind those words. The chief financial officer spoke first. We became too comfortable believing that multiple reviews guaranteed accuracy. We forgot that independent thinking is more valuable than repeated agreement. Alexander nodded. Exactly. He walked toward the large presentation screen where the corrected financial model still remained visible. Beginning immediately, every acquisition review inside this company will include an independent challenge session. During that session, every assumption may be questioned regardless of who asks the question. Evidence will matter more than job titles. One senior director smiled thoughtfully. That policy alone may become the most valuable outcome of tonight. Another executive quietly added, the strongest organizations do not eliminate questions. They encourage them. Alexander looked toward Zoe Mitchell with sincere appreciation. Miss Mitchell reminded us that wisdom does not request permission before appearing. It only asks whether someone is willing to listen. Zoe answered with her usual humility. The numbers deserved another look. Anyone could have noticed it. The chief financial officer gently shook his head. Perhaps anyone could have. But you did. Those simple words carried more respect than any formal recognition. One by one, several executives approached Zoe personally. An investment banker who had quietly laughed earlier extended his hand. I owe you an apology, he admitted honestly. When you first spoke, I dismissed your observation before I even considered it. Zoe accepted the handshake warmly. Thank you. We all make quick judgments sometimes. Another board member smiled with quiet embarrassment. I spent 30 years in finance, and tonight I learned that experience should never replace curiosity. Zoe responded gently. Experience becomes even stronger when curiosity stays beside it. Alexander watched every conversation unfold with growing admiration. Earlier that evening he believed leadership meant making confident decisions quickly. Now he realized great leadership also required creating space for unexpected voices to be heard. The lesson reached far beyond a single acquisition. It reached the culture of every future decision the company would make. As the executives slowly gathered their documents, the atmosphere inside the room felt completely transformed. Earlier the waitress had served coffee while executives led the conversation. Now accomplished executives stood quietly listening to the waitress because they recognized the value of her perspective. Respect had changed direction without anyone demanding it. It had simply followed the truth. Looking once more across the illuminated Manhattan skyline, Alexander understood that the greatest mistake a leader can make is believing intelligence always arrives wearing an impressive title. Sometimes the person capable of protecting an entire company is the same person everyone overlooked only moments before. And from that night forward, every important meeting inside his company would begin with one simple principle. Listen first. Judge later. Because the quietest voice may be carrying the answer everyone else failed to find. The executive dining suite gradually became quieter as legal teams packed away documents that only an hour earlier had seemed certain to define another historic business victory. Instead, everyone present understood they had witnessed something far more meaningful. Alexander Hayes approached Zoe Mitchell once more. This time carrying no contract, no presentation folder, and no sense of executive superiority. He carried only a simple business card bearing his direct contact information. He placed it gently on the conference table between them. Miss Mitchell, he said with sincere respect, I would like to make you an offer. Zoe glanced at the card but made no attempt to pick it up. She waited patiently for him to continue. Our company sponsors graduate education for future financial analysts. We also operate one of the most competitive strategic development programs in the country. I would like to cover the remainder of your education and invite you to join that program when you are ready." The room became perfectly still. Several executives smiled because they expected Zoe to accept immediately. It appeared to be an extraordinary opportunity, yet her response surprised everyone once again. She looked at Alexander with quiet appreciation before speaking. "Thank you. That is more generous than I ever imagined." She paused briefly. "But I would like to accept only under one condition." Alexander smiled with curiosity. "Name it." Zoe answered without hesitation. "Do not give me an opportunity because I saved one acquisition. Give me an opportunity only if I earn it through the same standards every other candidate must meet." Several executives exchanged impressed glances. Alexander studied her expression carefully. There was no pride in her voice, only integrity. She was asking for fairness instead of favor. The chief financial officer quietly smiled. "That answer tells me even more about your character than your financial analysis did." Alexander slowly nodded. "Very well. You will complete the same assessments, the same interviews, and the same evaluations as every applicant. The only difference is that tonight convinced me you deserve the chance to compete." Zoe finally picked up the business card with a grateful smile. "That is all I could ever ask for." One board member quietly remarked, "Most people hope success will remove the need to prove themselves. You seem eager to prove yourself anyway." Zoe answered gently, "Real confidence comes from knowing you earned your place." Those words remained with everyone in the room. Alexander looked toward the executives surrounding the conference table. "Please remember this moment," he said. "Talent asks for opportunity. Character asks for accountability." The chief financial officer added, "And together they create trust." Before leaving, Alexander instructed the human resources director to reopen the company's executive internship applications for one additional candidate. "No special treatment," he reminded everyone. "Only an open door." Zoe thanked the executives individually before preparing to return to her regular responsibilities. She carefully placed the silver coffee pot back onto the service cart exactly where it belonged. Her evening shift was not officially over, and she intended to finish every responsibility with the same professionalism she had shown from the beginning. Watching her quietly organize cups and plates after transforming the future of a multibillion-dollar decision reminded everyone of one remarkable truth. Extraordinary people rarely stop being humble after extraordinary moments. As Zoe gently pushed the service cart toward the hallway, Alexander realized the company had not simply discovered an exceptional financial mind that evening. It had discovered the kind of integrity that cannot be taught inside classrooms or measured inside spreadsheets. And he quietly hoped that one day, when she returned through those same doors, she would do so not as the waitress everyone once overlooked, but as the respected strategist whose place had been earned entirely through wisdom, discipline, and character. 6 months later, the Manhattan skyline glowed beneath a clear autumn evening as executives once again gathered inside the headquarters of Hayes Capital. The atmosphere felt familiar, yet everything about the room had quietly changed. A new acquisition was under review, financial models covered the presentation screens, and senior analysts prepared recommendations for the board. Alexander Hayes entered the conference room with the same calm confidence that had built his company, but this time he was accompanied by someone many people in the financial world had begun noticing. Zoe Mitchell, dressed in a professional Navy business suit instead of a waitress uniform, carried a notebook filled with careful observations. During the past 6 months she had completed the company's competitive assessment process, earned the highest evaluation among every applicant, resumed her finance degree with educational sponsorship, and joined the strategic investment division as an analyst. Every achievement had been earned exactly as she requested, through merit alone. As everyone settled into their seats, Alexander remained standing. "Before we begin today's meeting," he said, "there is something I want every new employee to understand." The room became completely silent. He walked toward the large presentation screen where a single sentence appeared. "Question assumptions before trusting conclusions." Alexander smiled thoughtfully. "Half a year ago, our company nearly completed an acquisition that would have cost us more than $3 billion, because we believed repeated agreement was the same as independent thinking. Several executives who had witnessed that evening quietly nodded. Alexander continued. The person who protected our company did not hold an executive title. She did not have a reserved seat in the boardroom. She simply had the courage to speak when everyone else believed there was nothing left to question. Every eye naturally turned toward Zoe. She lowered her head modestly, clearly uncomfortable being the center of attention. Alexander smiled. That humility is exactly why her example matters. The meeting continued, and during the discussion a junior analyst hesitated before raising a concern about one operating assumption inside another valuation model. Months earlier that hesitation might have disappeared beneath the pressure of experienced executives. Instead, Alexander immediately responded, "Please explain your reasoning." The room listened carefully. Zoe smiled quietly because she recognized what had truly changed. It was never only about saving one acquisition. It was about creating a culture where thoughtful questions were welcomed instead of dismissed. After the meeting concluded, Alexander and Zoe stood beside the panoramic windows overlooking the city that had unknowingly connected their lives. "Do you ever think about that night?" Alexander asked. Zoe smiled softly. "Sometimes." He laughed gently. "I think about it before every important decision." She looked across the light stretching toward the horizon. "I never wanted recognition. I only hoped the numbers would be reviewed one more time." Alexander nodded. "And because you cared enough to speak, thousands of employees, investors, and future opportunities were protected." For a quiet moment neither of them spoke. The city continued moving below, filled with millions of people whose potential remained unseen by those around them. Alexander finally broke the silence. "I learned something that evening no business school ever taught me." Zoe looked toward him with quiet curiosity. "What was it?" He smiled warmly. "The smartest person in the room is not always the loudest one. And the greatest leaders never stop listening." Zoe smiled in return before closing her notebook. Together they walked back toward the conference room where new challenges, new decisions, and new opportunities awaited. The acquisition that never happened slowly faded into company history, but the lesson it created became part of every decision that followed. Wealth may open doors. Titles may command attention. Experience may earn respect. But integrity, humility, curiosity, and the courage to speak the truth will always remain the qualities that change lives. Sometimes one quiet voice saves billions of dollars. Sometimes it changes the future of an entire company. And sometimes it reminds the world that real greatness is never measured by the position someone holds, but by the character they carry when nobody expects them to make a difference.